What you are watching right now is the opening cutscene to Shura no Mon, a title that translates to the Asura's Gate. Asuras being beings from Hindu tradition that, to be extremely reductive, are demons. So maybe we could call this the Demon's Gate. This cutscene goes on for 2.5 minutes. You've already seen everything this game introduction has to offer. There's a few change-ups to the music, but the visuals remain constant. The introduction to this game is 2 minutes of an old man doing stretching exercises. It's a completely bizarre choice of introductory cutscene for a fighting game. It doesn't convey any action or character. The best you get is that the animation looks kind of smooth. Shura no Mon has the weird distinction of being tied with 2 other games for having received the worst review in Famitsu Magazine history. This introduction really isn't helping its case. Even Japanese players consider this to be really weird. I've already made videos on the 2 other worst reviewed games. Pro Golfer Saru was a game for the Nintendo Wii that was all about extreme golfing. The biggest problem with it that I found was that there just wasn't much of the game. The single course in it only had 9 holes. Infuriating if you paid full price back when it was released, but it was still amusing for a half-hour worth of distraction. Pachinko CR Daiku no Gensan GB was the Game Boy version of a Pachi slot game that actually was the worst implementation of a Pachinko game that I've ever encountered, and I have played a weirdly large number of Pachinko games. So one game that wasn't that bad, and one that really was. And that brings me back to our stretching guy. Is Shura no Mon truly so awful that it deserves to be ranked among the worst of the worst? Or is this a case where the game's rough, but not in the running for worst fighting game of all time? Let's take a look. So what is Famitsu, and why should we care about their reviews? Yes, if you watched the other 2 videos you've already heard this part, but some people might have just clicked on this one or been drawn in because of the fighting game. They need to know about it too. Famitsu Magazine is Japan's premier video game magazine. They've been running since 1986. They started out bi-weekly, but now there's weekly issues. Famitsu has been covering Japanese video games for almost as long as there have been Japanese video games. Okay, I guess about 80% as long as there have been Japanese video games? Well, that's close enough for me. Roughly a year into publication, Famitsu set up a style of review that they've stuck by ever since. Every game got reviewed by 4 people, who wrote a small little paragraph about it, and gave the game a numeric score between 1 and 10. There have been around 30 games that have received perfect 10s from all 4 reviewers. For a while, they seemed to be handing out those perfect scores like popcorn, but they seem to have backed off on that lately. 3 games have received a cumulative score of 12, the lowest cumulative score. For what it's worth, I haven't seen any game that received a score of 1 out of 10 from any reviewer. Famitsu's review scores have been so closely followed that they've acted as tastemakers. However, you don't have to look too far to find Famitsu reviews that are eyebrow-raising. Games that were so notoriously buggy that they were virtually unplayable, getting high review marks, and games that became beloved classics that seem to have gotten low marks due to their genre or platform. So, like any game review, they need to be taken with a heavy dose of salt. But that doesn't mean that they're not worth looking at. Famitsu has a continuous record of pretty much every single video game released in Japan for the past 40 years. So that makes the things at the outer edges of their reviews kind of interesting to look at. The next big question is, what is Shura no Mon anyways? Shura no Mon is the story of Mutsu Tsukumo, a young master of the undefeated martial art Mutsu Enmei-ryu. And for the most part, his stories are just how he went to a martial arts tournament and beat up a bunch of guys. Shura no Mon was fairly popular, running for 10 years, And then coming back for a sequel series several years later, that also went on for quite a while. It was only natural for this kind of thing to get adapted to a video game, and that's why, in 1992, they published an adventure game on the Mega Drive. That game was not well received. You basically had to know the original story and then follow the plot exactly, and then in the rare fight scenes, the results were mostly random. So this was not a popular game, and Sega didn't do a follow-up. 6 years passed, publication of Shura no Mon ended, and Kodansha decided it was time for another game. If you're not familiar with Kodansha, they're a major print publisher in Japan, and in the 90s they took a swing at publishing video games for a while. For the most part, these were based on works that they published. Kodansha was a fairly active publisher for about a 5-year period, but I can't really say they had a lot of standout games. Mostly it's things you'd only be interested in if you were already a fan of the franchise. Kodansha would need a steady hand to make a fighting game based on Shura no Mon. In 1998, the genre was already starting to slide off its peak, but there was still room out there if you could make something really special. After all, Tekken 3 was the hot new game, and Namco's Soul Calibur was doing pretty well at arcades, and Capcom was keeping the torch of the 2D fighter alive, so all Kodansha had to do was make a fighting game that could compete with those. How hard could that be? To make Shura no Mon, Kodansha hired developer Viztech, truly a storied developer. They had a long history of making things like Jietai World, a full-motion video game about Japan's self-defense force, where the gameplay mostly consisted of answering quiz questions. And then there was the 4 Sankyo Fever games, which were Pachinko games. And then that's it. That is literally everything they developed before Shura no Mon. I'm beginning to see why this game was in trouble. Viztech did not remain in business very long, though for their last game they did make Kaijin Zona, a Nintendo-published title where I absolutely adore the cover art. So going in, what we had was a publisher who seemed to not really care about the quality of their output, and a developer with absolutely no experience with anything like developing a 3D fighting game. Well, that's a recipe for success. And how did the game turn out in the end? Well, let's dig in. Once you are past the old man stretching, we're at the title screen with 4 choices: single player mode versus a special challenge mode, and options. Options gives you 3 difficulty settings, 3 different levels that you can set your health to, 5 different settings that control how much damage you take. You have the choice to have a time limit or not, and finally you can choose between 2 different camera positions. So how does Shura no Mon play? Well, I'll be the first person to confess that I'm more of an enthusiast than fighting game expert, so you're going to see plenty of button mashing here. The feeling I get from Shura no Mon is that they were attempting to make a game that was kind of halfway between Virtua Fighter and Tekken. You're not going to find any flashy special moves. The most you might get is a character doing a flip. The way that the control scheme works is that the square button are punches, triangle are kicks, circle are strong attacks, and that varies for each character, and X is block. R1 and R2 will perform special moves, though I really wouldn't call them special here. For triangle and square, tapping the button is a light attack, while pressing a direction and hitting the button is a medium attack. I'm afraid I couldn't find a move list on the internet, or descriptions of what certain special abilities do. The manual has a very abbreviated move list for each character. It tells you the name of 6 things that they can do, but not what it actually is. Not a big deal when the move is to punch someone in the face, but it is kind of a big deal when they stand to one side and breathe for a second. Is that a buff? Maybe, I don't know. You can initiate grapples if you stand in the correct position, point in the appropriate direction for that character, and then hit circle. Once you've grappled, then you have to input another button combination to initiate a throw. The instructions don't tell you what that other combination could be though. And annoyingly, the throws are the most powerful abilities in the game, because in some of those cases, you can break your opponent's limbs. Take out an arm or leg and they're less effective for the rest of the match. Combat takes place on a featureless infinite plane. There are no ring outs here. You're also fixed relatively close to your opponent, so so it's not like you can just go running off to another country and leaving them standing there. All matches are just one-round affairs, just a matter of wearing down your opponent's life bar faster. When the battle is over, you'll notice something odd. Most of the time it takes 3 or 4 seconds before it registers that the fight's done, and then your opponent just falls over. Somehow I don't think they did that for dramatic effect. Something that you may have noticed by this point in the video is that a lot of these characters look the same. Shura no Mon has an exceptionally bland cast. You have your pick of 8 fighters, and 4 of them are just some guy in a karate gi, and they actually all use the same martial arts style. 2 wrestlers who just wear trunks. 1 guy who does Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and is probably the most effective character. And 1 guy in a black outfit, and while you might think that's because he's the villain, it's because he's a Catholic priest. I was going to drill down into these guys as individual characters, but I can't really tell the difference between most of them. Even the wrestlers don't play wildly different from others. I wound up beating the game by using Ignacio da Silva, the Brazilian fighter who took up martial arts because he got a bad call during the World Cup. Yes, really. He was so mad at the refs that he switched sports because there were no referees in martial arts. There are some additional characters that are used as bosses, including the game's sole female character. The only way to play as them is to use a cheat code. Something that you've probably spotted by this point is that Shura no Mon is a game that looks and sounds very bland. It almost feels like most of the game is just placeholder art and sound effects. There's no character voices at all, just the sounds of flesh hitting flesh. If you beat the game, you get a static screen with the exact same picture of your character that you've seen continuously. Shura no Mon really feels unfinished. Everything needs a bit more. The one exception to that is the special mode, where you have to defeat 100 consecutive fighters. This is based on one of the more popular storylines from the original. So how does it feel to fight in Shura no Mon? Well, it's slow, pokey, blocking requires weirdly precise timing. There seems to be inconsistencies in whether or not your moves will connect. I've gotten different actions out of the circle button at the same distance and with the same direction being pushed. This is clearly a bad fighting game. Even if you've never played a fighting game before, you would grab the controller for this one and go, yeah, this is pretty bad. It's tough to chain your attacks into combos. I mean, I'm sure it's possible, but most of the double and triple hits that you're seeing come from a single button press. I spent a bit of time trying to figure out if there were moves that flowed into each other kind of naturally, but I really couldn't find any, and the fact that movements are sometimes inconsistent didn't really help. That said, the AI is not great here. Even on the medium and high difficulty levels, there are gaps that can be exploited by certain characters. Particularly, a few of them have moves where just pressing the circle button is the most effective strategy. I have the distinct impression that all of the things that have turned fighting games into a science over the years weren't even considerations in Shura no Mon. Priority, reach, animation frames, the attitude seems to be, whatever. Basically, this feels like a game by people who hadn't really considered fighting games. A situation where not only did they not know what they were doing, they didn't know that they didn't know what they were doing. All that said, it's still not the worst fighting game. It's not even the worst PlayStation 1 fighting game I own. I feel like the game got knocked down a few extra points by Famitsu due to how poorly it used its license. That's something that doesn't make a bit of difference to me. This is definitely a game I'd break out to torture people with, but if I was hunting for the worst game, well, I'd only mention it because of its reputation. Shura no Mon is more forgettably bad rather than an affront to God and man. The reason I started looking at Famitsu's worst reviewed games was because I was hoping that they'd be something odd. Maybe games that were wildly ambitious but completely fell flat, or ones that were so buggy and flaky that just the act of playing them was a challenge. And what I found were pretty normal bad games. Pro Golfer Saru could actually be a bit of fun, as long as you didn't mind that you finished the entire game in 15 minutes. Pachinko CR Daiku no Gensan GB was actually a pretty bad pachinko game, but unless you had played a lot of pachinko video games, you probably wouldn't even be able to tell the difference between it and a, not really good, let's say functional. If you don't know pachinko video games, then you couldn't tell the difference between it and a functional pachinko game. And for Shura no Mon, what we have is a kind of generic, kind of bland fighting game. It's hard for me to tell what made these three stand out to the reviewers at Famitsu, compared to so many other truly dire games that I've played. I could dig into this further, looking at the games that got a cumulative score of 13 or 14. In fact, I've already made a video on one of the games that got a 14. But for the most part, the games there don't stand out to me. Well, except one that's been on my radar for a long time. Maybe someday I'll do a compilation video for the games that got 13 or 14. For now, though, I think I'm going to let this rest.